Hello everyone, welcome back to Chitheads. My guest today is Philipp Maas. Philipp is currently a research associate at the Institute for Indology and Central Asian Studies at the University of Leipzig, and was previously an assistant professor at the Department of South Asian, Tibetan, and Buddhist Studies at the University of Vienna in Austria. He received his MA and doctorate degrees from the University of Bonn, Germany, where he studied Indology, comparative religious studies, Tibetology, and philosophy. His first book is the first critical edition of the first chapter, the Samadhipada, of the Patanjala Yoga Shastra, i.e. the Yoga Sutra of Patanjali, together with the commentary called Yoga Bhashya. He published inter alia on classical yoga philosophy and meditation, as well as on the textual tradition of the Patanjali Yoga Shastra. For the last couple of years, he worked in several research projects directed by Professor Carine Preisendonz at the Austrian Academy of Sciences and at the University of Vienna in Austria, that aim at a critical edition of the third book of the oldest classical text corpus of Ayurveda, the Charaka Samhita. Since 2009, he is a member of the Historical Sourcebooks on Classical Indian Thought project, convened by Professor Sheldon Pollock, to which he contributes with a monograph on the development of yoga-related ideas in pre-modern South Asian intellectual history. So with that, please help me welcome Philipp Maas. Philipp, so I wanted to ask you a sort of very sort of basic question, I suppose, which is, what is Indology for those that are not familiar with this term, Indology?
Indology is the study of culture and religion, philosophy of South Asia throughout the history from the earliest times up to the present day, more or less. And South Asia is a geographical area which is a little broader than modern day political India. It also encompasses the region of modern day Pakistan, parts of Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal, and so on. And in historical terms, it starts at the times of approximately 1500 BC, from where we have the oldest recorded sources, Vedic literature, and it continues more or less to modern times, to literature in modern Indian languages. So from this definition, you already see that not a single person on this planet is able to really know everything or have a solid knowledge of all aspects of Indology. So for me, the main emphasis is on classical Indian literature, on literature in Sanskrit, composed from the earliest times until maybe late medieval times, that is maybe 15th century in pre-modernity. I have not worked a lot on modern Indian literature.
Right. So in your in one of the articles that I read in preparation for this interview, which you had shared with me, a concise historiography of classical yoga philosophy, you go through, this the history of scholarship on classical yoga. But I was just curious about, again, a more basic question. I was curious about this word historiography and how this differs from just saying a history of classical yoga philosophy. What is it? What are the stakes behind using this term historiography?
Yeah, a history of yoga philosophy would focus on actual developments in yoga philosophy. Yoga philosophy as a certain trend of philosophy and how this developed over time. Historiography is an academic discipline which deals not with the subject which is addressed, but on the history of this subject. So I'm researching in this article the history of research on yoga.
So it's almost like a meta-analysis.
It's a meta-analysis of the historiographical writing on yoga. Yes.
I see. Okay. And so in this text, you speak on particularly how the role of British colonization and what it played in our understanding yoga's history. And so I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about that. I mean, obviously this is a huge question, and there are many ways you could approach it, but from your point of view, you know, what are the kind of key points that we should learn from this role that British colonization played on our understanding of yoga's history?
Yeah, yoga was not viewed very favorably by early Indologists and also by the colonial powers. That had something to do that the actual yogis that lived in 18th, 19th century India were quite far away from the ideals of living that Victorian British society had. They didn't have, they didn't lead a family life. They had given up their social obligations. And some of these yogis, they were also joined in armed forces that had a quite revolutionary potential, which were
Right.
against the government of the British. And that contributed to the fact that, that there was a low estimation of yogic practice and the yoga way of living during that time.
Mm, mm.
So
what the yogis were not particularly esteemed by the colonizers, but were they very esteemed even in the culture of India at the time? I mean, what was the relationship of the yogis to the mainstream culture?
from a theoretical point of view, the aiming at spiritual liberation is one of the aims that are to be followed according to classical Indian literature. So there are four values that a human being should pursue. One is dharma, that is following social and juridical obligations and also ritual obligations. The second one is artha, that is meaningful action, also the acquiring wealth. Then karma, which means enjoyment, also sexual enjoyments. And then as the fourth goal to be pursued, spiritual liberation. So
Right.
there was definitely acceptance in the classical Indian societies for pursuing spiritual liberation. From an early time onwards, the way of living as a homeless beggar in order to pursue this spiritual aim was accepted. And at the time of the early juridical literature, it's a so-called Dharma Shastra, this way of living was integrated into a scheme of different periods of life that members of the first three classes of society should follow. That is starting one's life as a brahmachari, that is as a Veda student, then a second period of life in which one should marry, have a family, then that is the period of a grihasta. Then afterwards, third period follows in which one gives up living as a house father, and in the end, then as a sannyasin, one even gives up one's home in the forest and wanders as a homeless beggar. So
Right.
there was acceptance for this way of living in the traditional Indian societies, I would say.
Yeah. Yes. So to move on to something that you've done a considerable amount of work on, the Patanjali Yoga Shastra. The way that this is typically understood, at least in the context of yoga teacher trainees, communities who talk about who study the Yoga Sutra, it's often posited that the sutras were by this guy named Patanjali, and then the Bhashya, or the commentary, was written by an individual named Vyas, and so one of the fundamental contributions that you've made is really to challenge this seeming orthodoxy about the authorship of the Yoga Sutra, and and your point being that the authorship is really there is evidence to support the idea that authorship is more singular, that that Patanjali wrote both. So can you kind of lay that out for us and talk to us about if it is one author, why it would be separated into two different parts in this way that would suggest that it was by two different authors?
Yes, maybe a few introductory sentences on this, answering this question. When we are dealing with the past in historical academic endeavors, we are always dealing with imperfect evidence. Yeah, so
Right.
it's not about something being true or wrong, black or white, but we have a certain amount of evidence, and we try to reconstruct a certain picture of it, and we have maybe also other kinds of evidence, and in the end we have to weigh this evidence in order to develop hypotheses. And these hypotheses should always be open for revision. So if new evidence comes in, the picture may change. So I consider myself as a part of this academic process. So I don't have any spiritual authority to talk about this matter, but I'm talking on the basis of evidence that I can find. So maybe for our listeners, it may be unusual to ask another very basic question, namely, from where do we know what the Yoga Sutra is actually? Yeah. So how can we know? I mean, the easiest approach would be to go to a shelf and take a book out and look what is there. But then the question arises: where does this book come from? Yeah, who was the person to write this book? Yeah, we may have an introduction which tells us that it's a very ancient text. But yeah, where does the editor of the Yoga Sutras know what the Yoga Sutras are actually look like? So, if we think through that, we necessarily come to the idea that a person based first printed edition on manuscript evidence. So written texts that contain the Yoga Sutra in a certain format, either on palm leaf or on paper, that somebody had been writing down. The question then is, where did this person get, the scribe of this manuscript, get the information to write the Yoga Sutra? And then one realizes that manuscripts in India actually don't survive for a very long time. What we have now are copies of copies of copies that go back a long way. So we have to take the manuscript evidence very seriously when we come to asking this question: what does a text look like, and who was the author of the text? One source of information that these manuscripts contain are manuscripts, so-called colophons. These are informations at the end of the individual chapters where something is said about the work. For example, the name of an author is recorded there, and also the title of the chapter. And if we look into the manuscripts of the Patanjali Yoga Shastra, that is the Yoga Sutra together with the Yoga Bhashya, we see that the Yoga Sutra is not actually separated in these manuscripts from the Bhashya text. Except in very, very recent paper manuscripts where we have enumeration, and each and every of the sutras is nicely enumerated. But the more older manuscripts, they do not contain any separation between sutra and bhashya text at all, but they contain, as well as the other manuscripts as well, these chapter colophons about which I have been talking. And these chapter colophons clearly tell us that we have a work in front of us with the title Patanjali Yoga Shastra, Sankhya Pravachana, and Sankhya Pravachana means magisterial teaching of Sankhya. So, there's only one author name, namely Patanjali. Nothing is said about Vyasa or Veda Vyasa. Only very, very recent paper manuscripts contain information that this text would have been a bhashya written by Vyasa. So then the question arises, where does this information come from with Vyasa? Yeah? Read this in our handbooks of Indian philosophy. And if one goes to the sources, one sees that only comparatively late sources actually introduce the name of Vyasa. Yeah, we have the Sarvadashana Sangraha by Vidyaranya from the 14th century, and that is the first source that I know that says very clearly we have the Yoga Sutra on which an author called Vyasa commented upon. Then if we go through different philosophical texts, we found quotations from the Patanjali Yoga Shastra in these texts. Sometimes we find extracts from the Bhashya, to which the author says, Iti Patanjali. So he says that the quote that he quotes was authored by Patanjali. And these instances, these quotes are comparatively early from the 9th or 10th century. And these are much earlier sources than the Sarvadashana Sangraha, which is 400 years later, in which we read that there is a separate authorship. Then there are further arguments. One of the arguments concerns the earliest quotation that we have from the Patanjali Yoga Shastra. And these are not, as one might think, the Yoga Sutras, which are very famous texts and very old. But what we see, what we find are quotations from the Bhashya. Quotations originally already in the Nyaya Bhashya, which is from the 5th century, and also in the ancient Vritti of Bhartrhari's Vakyapadiyya, a work on philosophy of language, which may be from the 6th century. There we also find quotations from the Bhashya part of the Patanjali Yoga Shastra. Then another additional piece of evidence comes from the reception of the work in poetical literature. We have a highly esteemed poem, Mahakavya, by a poet called Maga, and he refers repeatedly, without naming any author, to the Patanjali Yoga Shastra as a unified whole. So he more or less quotes Patanjali when it comes to yogic meditations at a certain sacred mountain, and the piece of text that he draws upon from his quote really combines the sutra together with the Bhashya. So already at the time in the middle of the 8th century maybe, this work was seen as a unified whole and was used by a poet in order to use it for his poetry. And the most important argument in my view is that we have at least one instance in the Patanjali Yoga Shastra itself where we have a pronoun that refers to something that has been said before. And the sutra text itself does not have any referent for this pronoun. This pronoun in the sutra refers to a passage from the Bhashya. And this clearly indicates for me that there was an individual author who saw sutra and Bhashya as a unified whole, and not that there was sutra text that had existed independently for a long time, and then a commentator at a later time wrote a commentary on it. There are other indications within the Patanjali Yoga Shastra itself. So the Bhashya part, for example, does nowhere discuss any alternative explanations of the sutra text. So apparently there was no earlier commentary tradition on the Yoga Sutra. It also does not discuss any variant readings, that the sutra text was read like this or that. No, it appears as a unified whole. Then, of course, the sutra text is very much embedded in the work. The sentences do not make any sense anymore if you withdraw the sutra from it. And some modern researchers have argued that the author of the Bhashya wanted to appear the sutra to be an integral part of his work, so that he was kind of misleading his reader. But as I see no evidence for the fact that the sutra ever existed at an early time for itself, I rather would say, the face value of this of the Patanjali Yoga Shastra has to be taken seriously. And this is the conclusion I arrived at after waiting the the evidence, and I'm pretty much open to revise my position if somebody would come up with a serious discussion of my hypothesis and would bring to my knowledge alternative evidence which would justify to change my view on this question.
Well, it's nice to hear that you remain flexible in the face of possible evidence, but it sounds pretty convincing what you're saying. I guess the question that I have is, and I understand like we have all of this evidence to support that they were never perhaps separated, but why then the apparent separation? I mean, what's the utility of having a kind of cryptic thing, piece of the text like the sutra and then the bhashya separate? Was it in service of some kind of memorization practice, or are there other reasons for this, according to what your conjecture would be?
Yeah. So first of all, I would say that what we nowadays find in the editions of the Yoga Sutra as the text of the Yoga Sutra is maybe not actually the Yoga Sutra as it was meant to be read. Yeah, nobody ever prepared a complete critical edition of the Patanjali Yoga Shastra and tried to separate the sutra from the bhashya. I think one could maybe come to different conclusions, and one sees also in different editions that there is a slight variation. Some editions take the one or other sentence from the bhashya as being a sutra, and other editors thought, no, that this is not a sutra part, this is part of the bhashya. So this is still something we actually don't know. Because very few of the sutras are actually introduced as being sutras. I think there are a couple of instances where the author of the bhashya says, oh, for this and that reason, there is the following sutra. Yeah, that happened, and then we read the Yoga Sutra. There are also instances where at least one where the author of the bhashya part says, and there is a sutra, and he quotes a sutra which actually is not seen as a Yoga Sutra, but a sutra from a different work. Actually do not know. So the question how to separate the sutra from the bhashya is a difficult one. But obviously, Patanjali followed a certain, model of how philosophical texts are written at his time. And it's very usual to have sutra text and then to comment upon the sutra text in a commentary. One argument that I did not mention when we were talking about sutra and bhashya is that the word bhashya does not occur a single time in the Patanjali Yoga Shastra. Yeah? So this is a designation that was given for this commentary by later authors, maybe not as a title, but as a kind of a description of the functioning of this text. So that this is a bhashya, on a sutra. Yeah? So sutra and bhashya are not necessarily titles for works, but they are designations of different types of literature.
I see. Okay.
Another possibility would be that in creating the Patanjali Yoga Shastra, the author wanted to create an authoritative book, an authoritative work, and in doing so, he wanted to create the idea that he was drawing upon ancient ideas. And therefore, he was using earlier sources, which he was quoting as his sutras, and then he was given the information and the explanation of these brief and cryptic phrases that he thought would contribute to building up this system of thought that he had in mind to build.
So then, you mentioned that at a certain date we start to see Vyasa, more recent. These are at a more recent date we start to see Vyasa attributed to the bhashya. Why do you think that crept in? Do you think it crept in from a confusion about the sutra and the bhashya actually being separate texts, and so someone wanted to attribute it to Vyasa? And I know, we have this history of Vyasa being almost a mythological author with the Mahabharata and other texts. So is it yeah, so I'd love to hear your thoughts on why you think that became sort of interjected
Yeah,
into the conversation.
yeah. I mean, of course, I can only answer in a hypothetical manner. I don't know
Yeah. Right.
what happened. And yeah, different factors may have contributed to this. The first thing may be that a certain convention had established itself that philosophical systems consist of a basic text and then a commentary on this text. Like we have, for example, in the tradition of Nyaya, we have the Nyaya Sutra as a base text, and then we have the Nyaya Bhashya as a commentary. And yeah, we have many philosophical texts with the base text and then with the commentary. But of course, we have also examples for the opposite, where one individual author created the base text and then a commentary. But I think the first discussed case is more frequent. And therefore, one may have asked oneself, so who was the founder of the yoga system, and who was the person who then wrote the first commentary? And then there was the idea that these should be kept separately. And as you mentioned yourself, Vyasa is not necessarily the name of a person. It can also be a designation for somebody, for a function in a literary process.
Yeah.
It may also mean something like compiler. Yeah, so we all know that a lot of the Puranas are attributed to an author called Vyasa. We know that mythologically the name of Vyasa is associated with the process of separating for individual a unified set of Vedic teachings into 4 separate collections or samhitas. And it's clear that this is all mythology because these texts were composed at very different dates in Indian literary history, and no single person could have lived long enough to separate the Veda and the Puranas. So, yeah, the question why it was Vyasa and not somebody else is something I'm still researching. I'm not sure what this had to do. I suppose that the kingdom of Vijayanagara, which was a South Indian Hindu kingdom, in contrast to North Indian Muslim kingdoms, which developed a very strong identity of being Hindu, used the Yoga Sutra together with the Patanjali Yoga Shastra as a kind of emblem, and that the idea that they were written by 2 different authors was developed at that time.
Yeah, I like the way you put it. I haven't heard it put quite that way, that Vyasa designates a function in a literary process in some instances, and I think that's really interesting way to think about it, because it also invites in a kind of different conversation about what is authorship, because oftentimes when we're looking at authorship, we impose our sort of contemporary notion of the author onto these texts, and it's not always it's sometimes ill-fitting. So I like that way of thinking about it, a different kind of function in the literary process that doesn't have to be the traditional kind of authorship. So now we've sort of been talking a little bit about challenges presented by the composition of the Patanjali Yoga Shastra, one being that it's not always clear what is a sutra, because it's not always declared, and certainly sutra and bhashya are, as you say, not differentiated within some of the texts that we find. So what are some other challenges that are presented by the composition of the Patanjali Yoga Shastra?
What do you mean with challenges? Challenges for whom?
For I don't know, scholars, or I mean I'm thinking particularly about this one author who you mention in this historiography text, where he it was towards the end of the article. I'm so sorry. I think it was Obenhammer or something similar to this.
Oberhammer, yes.
And he was and you were discussing how his work should have been taken more seriously, because he was pointing out essentially four different types of practice that solved some of the problems with the challenges that are presented by the Shastra's composition. So that's sort of what I'm thinking about when I'm does that make sense?
Yes, that makes that makes sense. Yeah, yeah. As you say correctly, the Patanjali Yoga Shastra is a challenging text. Yeah, in many respects, it's not a straightforward text. It does not follow the literary conventions that we are used to see in the texts that have been produced in a Western modern context. It's not an introduction to yoga philosophy for beginners. Yeah? It's very very difficult to actually find out what were the guiding principles of arranging the text in the way that it was arranged. And that there are some basic, there's a basic knowledge systematic behind this. We start with a general introduction of what yoga is, then the functioning of the mind is addressed, what are the functions of the mind, and then we come to different kinds of yogic meditations that are differentiated. Oberhammer had a quite clear view on different structures of meditation with different objects of meditation and also with different purposes of meditation. And his differentiation of four different kinds of meditation in the Patanjali Yoga Shastra, at least for me, appeared very convincing, and that helped me to make sense out of different difficulties that the structure of the text poses for me, or challenges, like you put it. Yeah.
Okay. So then, towards the end of this article, you discuss kind of the future of research in yoga philosophy, and two things that you mentioned. I'll just take them in turn. The first one is you mention two transmissions of the Patanjali Yoga Shastra, one corresponding to the north and one to the south. Can you, I don't think I've really ever heard about this until I read your work, and I know this is going to be new for a lot of people. What do we learn about the overall work from the kind of bringing these two transmissions together?
Yeah, if you open a book and you read a printed edition of the Patanjali Yoga Shastra in Sanskrit, you will find that quite a number of passages are very difficult, and there are further passages out of which you hardly can make any sense. And this is the reason why most of the translations of the Patanjali Yoga Shastra we have are very unsatisfactory. I think a quite good attempt to translate this book was done already in 1914 by Woods, who in the Harvard Oriental Series published a publication of the translation of the Patanjali Yoga Shastra together with the Tattva commentary by Vachaspati Mishra. Woods was a good Sanskritist, but he had the problem that he created a new type of English, a new idiom, in order to translate technical terms of yoga. So you have the problem that you only can understand his translation if you understand the Sanskrit text, so that was not a very useful approach for a general public. Yeah? It's not an appealing translation that yet, but it's a good one. Some of the textual problems that one has can be solved if you compare different versions of the Patanjali Yoga Shastra. So I was already talking about the fact that we have manuscripts that transmit the work, and these manuscripts are copies of previous copies, and these copies go back along the lines of history. And if we are talking about manuscript copies, of course, we are talking about copies that have been prepared by human beings. That means scribes who copied the text and who changed the text during their activity of copying it. And it's impossible to copy a longer amount of text without changing it. That's for human beings. There are different kinds of changes that may occur, either involuntarily, you just make a mistake, you misspell something, or you drop a line out. Or, I mean, if you are a part of the tradition and you actually follow the text that you are copying, it may occur, and you are aware of the fact that you're also reading a handwritten copy in which there may be already mistakes. You may try to change the text according to your knowledge of the text. So there are also voluntary changes that occur in the course of copying the text. And yeah, of course, this amount of changes during the copying process that accumulates in the course of time. So that we have as many versions of the text as we have manuscripts in the end. Slightly different. Yeah, you can clearly see that it's the same text, but different versions differing in hundreds and thousands of respects. Individual words there are lacking, synonyms occurring at the same spot, differences in syntax, and so on. This process of transmission can be used on the background of a philological method to reconstruct earlier versions of the text. Because a change that once has occurred in the process of copying a text remains within in the text, because the copyist of the previous copy will recopy the change that had been introduced at an earlier instance.
Right.
And, in the end, in the case of the Patanjali Yoga Shastra, one can see that one can clearly differentiate two versions. One version that we find in North Indian paper manuscripts, and these were the versions that were used to prepare the print editions that we know nowadays. And there are quite a lot of manuscripts from the South that transmit a different version. And I would say that on every page, you usually find, I would say, 5 or 6 instances where the text differs seriously, not only with regard whether you have a conjunct more or whether a conjunct is a disjunct, but really serious textual differences. And this makes it highly important, actually, to take into account all the evidence of the manuscript we have and to prepare a real scholarly critical edition of the Patanjali Yoga Shastra, which also will then contribute to solving the question that we discussed further before, what parts of this work is a sutra, what part is a bhashya, and so on. So that's also something that people don't realize. The study of these texts are very much in their infancy. We are in a completely different situation than we are for texts that come from the Greek culture or Latin texts, where generations of researchers have looked at all the important manuscripts and prepared real solid scholarly editions. We don't have something like this for most of the Indian material. Okay,
so my next question then is, well, I guess it's 2 parts. One is, I understand that, to a philologist, these 2 transmissions and the differences between them may be quite stark. But, for someone who's just trying to extract kind of the general meaning of a particular text, it might not seem that glaring. So I'm curious if, what, if any, of these differences actually challenge us in terms of the meaning of the text, and if you could touch on that. And then I'm also curious, if you find what you see as being kind of the biggest disjunction between the kind of contemporary transmission of this text or the contemporary understanding of this text compared to what you see as being, I don't know if original is the correct term, but what you find in your own research in terms of the meaning of the text.
Yes. I don't think that this philological work that I'm doing only concerns superficial changes of the text.
Right.
I think that there are many instances where there are really severe differences of the text and real severe differences between the historical reconstruction and what we find in the Bhagavad. It's not just a philologist's pleasure, but no, it's something that work that needs to be done to say something seriously.
Yeah.
because the text is also very, very dense. Yeah, so it's the whole text is composed in what one could say sutra style. That means each and every word is completely loaded with meaning. Yeah, very difficult to understand at instances, and yeah, if you look at to it and go for it and bring it into relationship to other texts, then here real universes of thought may emerge from this. I can a single example, one of my favorite example when it comes to discussing the textual differences. We have in Patanjali Yoga Shastra 129 one result of the meditation on Ishvara. And in the Bhagavad version, the Sanskrit text reads Swa Purusha Svarupa Darshana Asya Bhavati. That means the yogi acquires the sort, the sight of Svarupa, of his own form. And one wonders what this should mean. How can I see my own form? What is this? What is this own form? Usually, Svarupa is not something to look at. Yeah, Svarupa is the real essence of something. So very puzzling formulation. And if you look into the southern version of this text, you suddenly see that it's not Svarupa but Svapurusha. That means one's own Purusha. Yeah. So the yogi acquires the sight of his own inner self, yeah, of the Purusha, of his own souls, so to say, if you want to translate Purusha in this way. And this connects very nicely to the idea what the Ishvara is in Patanjala Yoga, namely nothing but a special kind of Purusha. So it is a liberated soul, so to say, an archetype of a liberated soul. And on meditating on this archetype of a liberated soul, the yogi acquires sight, direct perception of his own soul, and that leads him to liberation. And in this way, you can understand what the meditation, Ishvara meditation in the Patanjali Yoga Shastra actually is about, something you could not know if you look at the Bhashya in its Bhagavad version. So this is just one example. As you see from the amount of information that I have to provide to make this understandable for you, all these examples, of course, require contextualization, and I think we don't have time here to discuss this in more detail. But yeah, this is something that you have to believe me, because I have been working on this. It's valuable, yeah, to do this philological work, and of course. Academic work needs a certain sequence of progress. Now, the works of Platon, for example, they have been edited to the best of one's capacity, and then philosophers start to interpret them, to set them into the relationship to the pre-Socratics and to what came afterwards. And in this way, we have a history of Greek philosophy, for which the critical edition of the text is one precondition. And India is no exception. Academic enterprise of researching the history of Indian philosophy should basically follow the same methodology, and it's important actually to have reliable editions of these texts.
Yeah, absolutely. I can definitely see where where that difference can really lead to quite radically different conclusions about what the goal or the objective is in terms of that particular practice. So that's interesting. So then in terms of what, and of course, we could talk about, and I don't want to get too far left field of, the ways in which the Yoga Sutras has been appropriated. I mean, I know there's many problematically, distilled versions of it, particularly in assuming that, that we get, for example, all of our contemporary asanas from this text, which is a very crude misunderstanding. But maybe just a couple thoughts on ways in which you see the contemporary relationship to the Yoga Sutras differing from perhaps what the authorial intention as you understand it might have been. And I'm thinking maybe particularly in terms of, you know, innovations or approaches to the text like Vivekananda's, where there was a sense of almost saturating it with a Vedantic worldview or attempting to kind of integrate Sankhya and Vedanta in some way. So anyway, do you have any thoughts on that? The difference between the authorial intention versus how the text is being used today?
Yeah, I mean, the way, I think there's no unified way in which the text is used today. Different authors have
Yes, right.
used it in different ways. But I think that there is a certain tendency that one can see, namely that people use the Yoga Sutra, which is a quite difficult Sanskrit text. If it's taken by itself, almost incomprehensible at various instances, to use this as a canvas to project their own philosophical ideas on it.
Yeah.
I don't have any problem if philosophers develop their ideas along the lines of exemplars that they find in the Indian tradition. I find this very, very useful to develop new philosophical ideas on the basis of older ideas. But I think one should be honest about one's own project. And one should say, I interpret certain material in a novel way. I am inspired by some sources that I find in Sanskrit, and I try to change their meaning, to adopt it to the needs of modern persons, rather than saying that I have discovered the original meaning that Patanjali had, and my
Right.
interpretation of the Yoga Sutra, this is what can be found in the Sutra. And
Right.
you can miss many of these pseudo-original interpretations of the Patanjali, of the Yoga Sutra, if you look into the Bhashya text. And even if the Bhashya text was not written or composed by the same person, there is no doubt in the scholarly community that it was composed very, very very close time to the Yoga Sutras, except if you have some. I would say political motivated authors who want to project the Yoga Sutra far back to the Indus Valley civilization and say that yoga is timeless and Patanjali was an ancient rishi. Yeah, if you look on the even on the Yoga Sutra for historical reasons, it's clear that it must have been composed somewhere in the 4th century of the Common Era. It cannot be older, and the Patanjali Yoga Shastra was also composed during this time. So in any case, the Bhashya part should be taken seriously when one interprets the Yoga Sutra, if one is interested in what the text had to say in its original context. If one does not want to follow this approach, then one should honestly say what one is doing. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. So so this has been a very interesting talk, and we're getting towards the end of our time here. So Philip, I just wanted to ask if there was anything else in relation to what we've been talking about that you'd want to touch on, or that you'd want the listeners to be familiar with.
Yeah, you already mentioned that some people actually regard the Patanjali Yoga Shastra as the source for actual asana practice that we find nowadays, and I think that this is maybe also a little bit a distortion of the historical evidence. Asana practice plays a certain role in the Patanjali Yoga Shastra, but it's only very briefly mentioned in this text. And asana practice is basically assuming a firm position for meditation in order to something that you can maintain for a long time, to practice breath control, and then later meditations and dynamic asanas, for example, like we have in modern yoga practice, where you have a sequence of movements, is not mentioned in the Patanjali Yoga Shastra at all. So,
and actually, it's good that you mentioned that, because Philip is going to be participating in our upcoming online conference, depending on when you're listening to this podcast. Yoga Reconsidered is our next online conference, and it features Philip as well as 9 other researchers on the history of yoga. And Philip will be giving a talk on this very topic, on the topic of asanas in the Patanjali Yoga Shastra. So if you are listening to this and it's before the middle of February 2018, you can go to embodiedphilosophy.com/yoga reconsidered, embodiedphilosophy.com/yoga reconsidered, and you'll find information on how to sign up for that. So thank you so much, Philip. It's been such a pleasure chatting with you.
Thank you very much. It was my pleasure.